I think he points out a lot of interesting things, and he takes care to point out how like people have this misconception about Constantine, that he was like very liberal and he accepted the Christians, but what he actually did was they created this standardized set of dogmas, and you had to have a credo. Like if you wanted to be called a Christian, the Romans had to basically register you, and you had to repeat a certain religious credo that the Roman priests had created, right? Yeah, yeah, sort of, in a way. You could say that. Definitely,
Can,
like my perspective has definitely changed over the years. Yeah, in
can you
different ways.
can you talk about that a little bit? Do you still refer to the Hebrew Bible as your source of reality and world history and so on and so forth?
Um, I can't say like the Hebrew scriptures are still like great for me. They're definitely a great source of information. Uh, how do I put this? Like what I like to do with myself is from time to time I sort of step back from everything I believe to the best of my ability, and I just completely step away from it for a little while, just to see if I'm a little too emotional about something. And then when I come back to it, I try to reassess if maybe some of those things were inaccurate. So, like, with the Bible, for example, or the Hebrew scriptures, let's say, there were certain things like that where, I kind of took a step away from it for a while, and I said, okay, let's just see what happens if I step away from this for a little while, if my perspective will change. And so, yeah, definitely there were certain things when I came back to it, I was like, well, I really got to think about this some more, or maybe I was not looking at this the right way, or stuff like that.
Have
But
you
yeah, it's kind of broad, so yeah, I don't know if that
have you
answers your question.
No, it does. Have you had a chance, or maybe there was some sort of divine intervention where you found some other spiritual, I won't say religious, but spiritual texts where it had an impact on you and maybe challenged your beliefs as far as the Hebrew Bible and things like that? Have you read anything interesting? Maybe you heard something interesting like that really challenged what you initially believed.
A little bit, but for the most part, I would say it was just a change of my perspective and how I look at like certain spiritual things, if that makes sense. So,
So, like what? Like, give me an example, man.
okay, so like my understanding of who let's say the source, God, the creator, um, you know, there's different ways I could put it. My understanding of that, I would say, is a little bit different, or my relationship to that is a little bit different and less rooted in like something written or what somebody says. So if you could say like I have yeah, I'll say that if that makes sense.
Because when we originally spoke and we sat down for hours on end, you were dead set that the Hebrew text is the undeniable truth, and it shouldn't even sort of be attempted to be translated into our own mind. So now you're saying that maybe through some situations in life or divine intervention, whatever you want to call it, your perspective from that has shifted. Now you're realizing God in a new light.
Let's just say, okay, how do I put this? It's just kind of hard. It's hard for me to explain it in a way like where it comes out the way I want it to come out. So, how do I put this? So,
I'm gonna ask you
okay,
directly. Do
if
you
there's
do I'm sorry. I'm gonna ask you directly. Do you still believe in the God of Moses?
uh yeah, you could say so. You could say so. Um that's kind of a a whole conversation itself. But if I could kind of explain what I meant by that when I told you that, the only way I can kind of explain it right now is that so nowadays, let's say I read something in Bible or something, even if even if I study it out really well and I'm very rigorous about it and I get many different interpretations, I check the translation, I look at the source documents where they came from, even if that all looks really good, I no longer I still keep my mind more open still to the possibility that that could all be wrong, especially if there's something inside me telling me this this doesn't feel quite right. I listen to that voice before I take the word of the text. Does that make sense? Whereas
Okay.
before I was more, let's say, cerebral about things, I was more willing to trust a cerebral or intellectual concept or understanding, even if I felt like I had a really good case, right? Now that's less so. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So what do you think changed?
Well, there were certain things. Okay, has this ever happened? I don't mean to be like vague, so I'm trying to
No,
be a
no.
little more specific. Has this ever happened to you where, like, okay, there was something you studied really thoroughly, or you felt like it was really thorough, and you felt like you turned over all the rocks and you looked under every rock, and you're like, well, I pretty much have all the information. I was pretty fair about it. I looked at different people's viewpoints, and you're like, well, shit, like this is pretty much the only way you can look at this. There's only one answer here. Like the evidence all points to this, bang, this is it, boom, right? And then one day you meet someone from like Indonesia or something, and you show them that exact same piece of information. They look at it, they interpret it a completely different way. They explain it to you, and you're like, oh shit, I never looked at it that way. And you're right. Does that ever happen to you? Something like that?
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's a beautiful thing for you not to be for you to be open-minded enough in order for that to happen. So could you share maybe a situation like that that happened to you that was like enlightening, or a light bulb has switched inside your head?
Um, okay, I'm trying to think of
Off
because there's a
off
few
top
things
of your
like
head.
that. Like basically, there's just things that were like I said, I had a kind of an uneasy feeling about certain things I believed. So at one point, I think we talked about the name of God, right? At some point,
Yes.
and I gave you a name. I was like, "This is the name. That must be
Mhm.
the name." And I simply interpret, in my opinion, at this point, I simply interpreted it incorrectly. And someone one day gave me a very, very good case for what they believe, and I was like, well, yeah, I mean that is a very good case you have there, sir. And I had to rethink that. That was one thing. So I was pretty. That was a pretty big error. So I'm giving you an example of something I feel like was a pretty big error, and I feel pretty foolish about that because I used to be fairly vocal about that with people. And then I was like, you know what? I don't think I was telling people the right thing, at this point.
Nah, but it's very honorable that you're able to say this now. That you're not being hard headed. Like, no, I was right in this and that. So, Tomek, my question is, what is the name of God?
See, at this point now, like, I'm not going to be like, this is God's name or that's God's name. All I can say is, like, I have this evidence. This is what, the evidence for me indicates at least the biblical scriptural name, like academically, is probably something like Yahweh, which is like the convention, or Jah, or Jah or something like that, which is pretty much the conventional like academic understanding.
Mhm.
And so, in my opinion, I made a pretty big error there. There were other things where I felt like it was much more subtle. That's just a one where I was like, yeah, I kind of, I had a fairly big oversight there.
Could you say right now, like, what are some things that are still looming that you question as far as the Bible?
Um, I mean, there's so many things, right? The more you are interested in it, the more questions it seems like come up. There's so many. Like, I'm really curious about how the original apostles actually worked together, or what they did, because so much of people's concept of like Christ, Christianity, church, stuff like that, it's rooted in the Roman tradition after the Romans took over. Basically, they like co-opted the whole apostolic movement. And
Council
look,
of
so people,
Nicaea.
yes, sir. Yeah, and there were other councils also. So like the whole time around Constantine, and people. And here's the thing: there's a book called 381 A.D. It's one of the best books I read about this. Like, I haven't read many about this, but that one, it really sucked me in, because that author, I think he points out a lot of interesting things, and he takes care to point out how like people have this misconception about Constantine, that he was like very liberal and he accepted the Christians. But what he actually did was they created this standardized set of dogmas, and you had to have a credo. Like, if you wanted to be called a Christian, the Romans had to basically register you, and you had to repeat a certain religious credo that the Roman priests uh, had created, right? Or that they put a rubber stamp on. And if you didn't, like if you were one of those Christians who said, no, I don't agree with the Nicene Creed, for example, you were persecuted. Now, it
Mhm.
wasn't like the same level of persecution where they fed you to lions necessarily, but it was still severe. You could have might not be able to have a business, you might not be able to own property, stuff like that.
I think what a lot of people don't realize is that Constantine was probably the first one to politicize Christianity, if you will. He solely wanted to use Christianity for his political goals. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. The book also, which I really enjoyed this book, 381 AD, it talks a lot about that sort of stuff, the hidden machinations, the political things that were going on with Constantine. And like the author kind of does, I believe, it's been a while, but I believe he talks about how like you could kind of, you might be able to infer that like Constantine was doing these things disingenuously. Like it
Mhm.
was questionable whether he had an actual belief in Christ, or it was purely political. And
Well,
I'm
because
not able to answer that. I don't know.
I think I am able to answer that. I think at all the evidence that we see, Constantine was pagan, and he was always pagan. And the only reason why this is, again, this is my opinion, and the only reason that he used Christianity was to unify the Roman Empire, because if we look at that time, the Roman Empire was split into the West and the East. So I think he meticulously used this newfound movement for his political gain again.
Yeah, and if I would like, I think that's a fair interpretation too. Could be, yeah.
And I really think that from that point on, Christianity took a very left turn. I wanted to ask you this: Um, have you looked into any other gospels outside of the four gospels that we have now that have been left out of the New Testament after the Council of Nicaea? Have you looked into it at all?
Oh yes, yeah, I've yeah, definitely. It's one of my. I'm not a a scholar, but like it's definitely one of my biggest interests over the years is that sort of stuff.
So, what do you think now, man? What do you think? Do these other gospels, let's say Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas, all these other, do they have a place in the broader sense of the Bible?
Um, well, the way I went about that question personally was I was looking at again, if you go back to the apostolic, like the people who actually knew Jesus or their immediate like disciples that knew like Peter and Paul and stuff like that, what they wrote and what they said, they have texts, right? And those are not in the standardized sort of Bible you buy Barnes and Nobles. Those apostolic texts, and those guys clearly talk about which texts are very credible, and they are for the most part the same texts you find in the New Testament in terms of the classical gospels. There is some debate about, like, I think Revelation is fine, but it's not as well attested as like the classical gospels. Like it's not actually a gospel book, right? The Revelation. We're just talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the gospels. So
Mhm.
those are good, and those were basically the main books that they recommended as a primary source about Jesus. Like that is like in terms of if you want the most reliable documentation. Now there were other books like a lot of the second John, First John, Revelations. Most of those are similar. Like they were all recommended in the apostolic texts, from what I understand and remember, and a little bit of debate between some of them. And then there was a lot of the books, like for instance, there's pseudo epigraph. Like there's, I always have trouble with this word, pseudo epigraphal. There you go, pseudo epigraphal books and stuff. And for me, like in terms of Old Testament pseudepigraphal books, a lot of those are good, but then a lot of the New Testament ones are dubious, to me. Especially, like I look for corroboration from the earliest possible, like from the horse's mouth, if possible. Right? If I see like Jesus or one of the apostles actually talking about a book, then I think, okay, that is a legit thing, most likely, right? But then there's a lot of texts that are not well attested. It's just like they don't have a good chain of chain of custody. I don't like have I can't give you specifics on like the Gospel of Mary right now. It's been a long time since I looked at that one. There's many of them, right? There's like there's
Yeah.
Gnostic texts.
Hmm.
There's all kinds of things, and within all of those, personally, I've found very little where I would like use it as good evidence for anything. A lot of it's just like, I don't know, maybe, Whereas John,
The conventional ones.
those are solid, like historically, and like speaking of evidence, like examined as evidence, they're
Hmm.
solid, in my
So,
opinion. Whereas those
so,
other books, like if we were making a court case, you know what I mean?
mhm.
Yeah, exactly. Like I look at it like if you're making a court case.
So here's my question, and I think that a lot of people, this is where they find the problem, especially with the New Testament. Um, it has been translated into all of these different languages. As we know, people that speak more than one language, a translation can be lost when it's translated. It's not always literal. And Christianity within itself broke up into all of these different denominations. So my question is, what do we refer to find the closest to the truth of the New Testament? I know you just said the conventional four gospels, but are there four gospels that are in its original form? Like, this is my question, man. And I think that a lot of people, why they have a problem with the New Testament and with Christianity and Catholicism. So uh we all know that the New Testament has been translated into all of these different languages. You and I, being people that speak multiple languages, we know that a translation can be lost, then that not always can you have a literal translation. And that even caused for Christianity to divide into all of these different denominations. So my question is, are there texts that we can refer to that are solid to the truth that the apostles wrote, 60, 70 years after the crucifixions? Like, what do we refer to, man?
Yeah, that's a really like that's an interesting question, and it's kind of it is a bit there is a bit to it, like because so it depends on for me evidence, like good evidence. I like to use the courtroom standard as much as I understand it. Like when we talk about like shadow of a doubt, beyond a shadow of doubt, what seems reasonable, that sort of thing. And like, if you want, if you want to build like a fact in a court case or a criminal case, like the best thing is straight eyewitness testimony, multiple eyewitness testimony, well examined, and that corroborate one another. Those eyewitnesses do not have to have exactly the same story. As from what I understand, in most like detective work, usually the eyewitnesses have different stories, even if they were legitimately there. Like, sort of like, if you see a car accident, one person saw it from this angle, one person saw it from that angle. One person swears it was a yellow light, one person swears it was a red light, right? It doesn't mean either they weren't there or that their testimonies are wrong or anything like that. So I think with like the gospels, when you're trying to establish the basic facts, like that's the most important thing. Like, was there a Jesus? Did he exist? And then we're talking about like, okay, there's things people find hard to believe, right? Are miracles are possible? Was that stuff really well attested in like as evidence? Did he really rise from the dead? Was he
Walking on
actually,
water.
yeah, was he actually executed? Are there alternate explanations, like interpretations of the evidence that are plausible? So like I've read about this a little bit. So I think if you want straight like historiographical evidence, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are probably the best that it gets. Now let me here. So I think um, at least let me think. So not all of those were written directly by apostles. Um,
Right.
I believe John is reasonably attributed to John.
Hmm.
Um, Luke is reasonably attributed to Luke. It's been a while. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. But the point is, not all of them are directly attributable to one of the apostles. But they can, like, in my opinion, be reasonably set at the exact time period when the apostles were alive. And if you look at the different details, they match pretty darn well. Like, if you take several eyewitnesses and line them up, and they have very similar stories. So you get a consistent story about certain basic facts that is pretty consistent. And I think you could argue, like, okay, there's some differences here. Like, does that cause some doubt for some people? Sure. Like, that's understandable. I think that's reasonable. And I think that's reasonable to, like, debate that. And that's, like, probably why these books are probably the most studied things in history, is these kind of questions.